So for me, sometimes, especially when I started working with psychosis, this is what it felt like to work with somebody with a fixed, rigid delusion. Somebody who just was unable to hear what was being said. But what we know now about delusions is that they are truly part and parcel of the symptomology of schizophrenia. And the person who holds them really sincerely has a belief, and confronting that belief is frightening, terrifying even, I would say, for some of those folks. So it's kind of a tricky thing to work with. Up here we have a diagram of what is on the far right-hand side, private reality. Everybody has their own private reality. Every healthy person does. Then when we begin to interpret something, for example, if you've ever seen the silhouette of two faces looking at one another, the white part looks like a goblin, looks like a goblet, or some kind of a visual illusion. We may all agree, for example, that that looks like a goblet. Most of us would, but somebody would find something else. But generally they would be, you know, they might say, oh yeah, I see it, after we suggest something. But there's kind of a consensus reality when we see something that's a little bit more abstract that requires some interpretation. And then there's our own private reality. So I may have agree with a consensus reality about something, but I may also hold a private belief about that. And at the far end of my private reality self, if I'm way to the left, I'm holding a fixed delusion. And that's a belief that defies logic or evidence, and it is held on to very tightly. So an example for me would be when I was in a parking lot at one point and was talking with a woman. We were at a vegetable market, and we looked up in the sky, and there was an airplane flying across, and it was leaving a trail behind it. And she called those, she said, do you see the contrails? And I was like, well, I think that's just streams, you know, left by the plane. And she explained to me that that wasn't the case, that that was actually some poisonous gas that the government was spewing out over the population, and we really need to do something about that. On the other hand, this woman was perfectly normal in every other way. I mean, she did business, she was, you know, lovely otherwise. She just held a belief that was a little bit more outside the consensus reality. So I hope that that makes sense, and please ask any questions about that once we're through with this. When that delusion becomes problematic in somebody's life or obstructs living the kind of life or reaching the kind of goals that they want to, that becomes then clinical, particularly if there's danger of hurting self or others. So we understand that they are clients' beliefs. We're going to talk a little bit about how to work with them, how to talk about them, how to teach about them, and most importantly, how to reduce the impact of delusions that might be harmful. Delusions are developed out of our own history, our own baggage, perhaps some trauma that may have happened, or even a family of origin that may have been filled with conflict, making the environment unsafe, or parents or guardians who have been loud or angry for most of the time. Our beliefs about life, about ourselves, about the world, about the future are built on those kinds of experiences, as well as the genetics that are involved with psychosis type experiences. But so much of it belongs to the environment. And what happens is that we develop a biased reasoning, and we all have biased reasoning. And it is a belief that's harder to it is harder to reject something as untrue than to accept it as true. It's, in other words, it's just easier to accept the first explanation. I see this all the time in clinical counseling, particularly people who do not have delusional beliefs. For example, a couple in counseling says, well, he always does this and he always does that, but has never asked or checked it out. That's the beginning of a delusion for that person that does not get ultimately clinical in terms of its severity. But the person will grab onto some salient experience and attach a belief to that, and there's a lot of importance attached to that. The ability to think critically about that is limited. It is maintained, though, because the more we pay attention to something that we have an issue with, we reinforce that, the memories get bigger and deeper, and then things become filtered through that belief that was built on that memory or experience. So when we're working with delusions, particularly if there are negative symptoms, really the first order of business is to work on those negative symptoms, to get them up and active, even if it's just doing a card sort or playing basketball with rolled up paper into a wastebasket, walking around the agency, activity measures and monitors. That ability to get up and move is the most important, because if they're not able to do that, then it makes working on the delusion much harder. It raises the energy and it begins motivation. And it also helps in building a sense of accomplishment, specifically if they're working on cleaning a part of their house or doing the dishes, and being able to see something as having them done, it increases their self-esteem. So working on negative symptoms would be the first order of business. And then once we've got a person who's a bit more energetic, then we can work on the delusions either indirectly or directly, depending on the insight of the individual. But with fixed delusion, we're assuming that the insight's very low. So clients' beliefs may involve any of what you see up on the screen here. Paranoia is the most common. Religious delusions are also common and often, reflect the religious beliefs of that person's culture. Grandiosity is one that I've seen fairly often. A lot of persecution, a lot of guilt and sin, a lot of experiences of somebody controlling my mind or controlling my voice box so that I am perhaps having thoughts that somebody inserted in there, or I'm being made to say something that I didn't intend to say. Oftentimes there's delusions of reference, which is when an individual believes that whatever they're hearing is about them, something on TV, something on the radio. Erotomania I don't see very often, but it is out there. Delusions about my health and my body is fairly common. Thought insertion is, as we said, is in there. Delusions of poverty used to be common before there were widespread state support like Medicaid. Interestingly, that delusion doesn't pop up very often anymore because we do have at least some support state for healthcare. So how do we talk about delusions? This is the important thing. No one can be forced into belief, and no one can be forced into unbelief. So if somebody were to come up and tell me that my belief that my children are lovely, wonderful human beings, nobody is going to talk me out of that under any condition. Of course, I might have some evidence for that, but the gist of the matter is that I can believe that aliens have landed, that ghosts exist. And truthfully, many people in the United States and in every country do believe in that. And their life is not disrupted. And who's to say that those things aren't real? So really we need to keep in mind is when this is beginning to interrupt life, then we need to attend to it. But be aware that you're not going to be able to talk them out of it, okay? engagement is very huge. So making sure that this person feels relaxed enough to share with you something that anybody else would say, you're nuts, right? Or you know that that's not true. And I have heard clinicians say that. I've heard physicians say it, clinicians say it. Oh, you know that's not true. We've talked about this. And at that point, the working alliance is pretty much severed until trust can be built again. Gaining understanding is really important, particularly with regard to the delusion. So in my work recently, I had a young man who said that he felt like he needed to be responsible, or he wasn't being of service to anybody, or he was of no use. And I was really curious about where that came from in his life. And so questioning about that is about what happened in previous experiences, or is that a familiar feeling to you? Or do you remember feeling like that before somewhere? And so that gets a little bit underneath that top rough layer that's hard to break through. Improving daily living is also important. So making sure they have a nice place to live, they've got food, they've got some warmth is important. Otherwise, working on the delusions or hallucinations or whatever you want to work on is just really not going to work. We can also we use indirect methods. This was the first one. I thought we were going to direct first, but it's indirect. So indirectly, when there's fixed delusions, it's really counter to the relationship to begin with looking for evidence to dissuade the delusion. First, we want to understand it. We want to understand it from behind the client's eyes and try to interpret what that delusion is really telling us in terms of their life experience. How does that reflect their life experience? So you're not saying they're not right. You're really exploring, what is this like? What would it be like if I believed that? What might have provoked that kind of a belief in me, or an environment that might have produced that belief in me? And then to begin to work on the stress reduction. So if my delusion is that God is going to crucify me if I make a mistake, then the first order of business would be to teach how, when this happens, first, what are the clues that the beliefs are coming on, or that an episode is kind of coming on. Find the clues, and then look for stress reduction. So breathing, mindfulness, maybe distraction. One of my clients said today, it's easiest if I just sit in a dark room and let the thoughts happen to me, and let the experience happen to me, and then it moves on, and then I can go back through my day, which is a really lovely way to do that. And to teach emotion regulation. Some of that might be, how do I manage my beliefs when I think somebody's looking at me? Well, there's a couple of ways you can do that and still hold on to the belief that I'm being followed and you don't want to give that up. And that might be, would it be okay to turn around and check with the person to see if they are looking at you, or to do things like in the car or walking down the hall. I think those people are looking at me. Well, if I were in a store or walking up and down the hall, I often look at people, but that doesn't mean that I'm following them necessarily. Never think that as well. Yes, I do. Okay, so you've got a little tiny bit of evidence, but you're not directly confronting that. Emotion regulation is for me with clients a lot about what is appropriate behavior when I'm terrified and I'm out in public. What's the appropriate thing to do, instead of maybe hit somebody or scream at the top of my lungs or run away? Emotionally and behavior-wise, what's the most appropriate thing to do to get some help and support for yourself? And then use that stress reduction to regulate the emotion once I'm in a safe place. Indirect methods do lower distress because we can teach people that they can even recognize for themselves that over and over and over again, their fear of what may be happening hasn't really happened. So it's distressful, but we can bring that up and say, you know, sounds like a big concern that you have. How often has it become true? Let's figure out how you can relax while you're waiting to find out how it comes out, whatever their worry may be. So again, I found that breathing helps, being in a place where there's somebody to connect with, even if it's in a different room. I know somebody's in the house or somebody's in the apartment. Another thing too is to really work on sleep. Lack of sleep is huge, and we know also that folks who have delusions also can have some very terrifying nightmares with some of the same themes that run through those delusions. And so working with nightmares or nightmare protocols in a CBT fashion can be very helpful. You know, let's make sure this person is getting sleep. I had a client who had such bad nightmares that she avoided sleep. And of course, the longer she avoided sleep, the more she began to have some very serious delusions. And, you know, we needed the help of a good psychiatrist to help us with medication she was willing to take. And that really seemed to make a big difference. It was a turning point for her in terms of being able to think a little bit more clearly and follow some direction and build some insight on her own. Activity is super important. Having an experience of success in something that's tied to their values and their interests is really important. So this might be, you know, I've had success with working out with a mentor, learning to play a new instrument, actually, doing some artwork. Whatever it is that that person's values and interests are, little tiny things that might be really helpful. So there might be a goal of, well, I want to live peacefully without these voices and delusions. That's great, but it's so big and broad that it's really difficult to work on. What one thing would be legitimate to work on that is doable, that you'd be willing to do to begin to work towards having some of that peace, or a belief that you're safe even though these intrusive thoughts are happening. Indirect methods are very practical in terms of setting goals. So I want to spend less time thinking about suspicious thoughts because it's exhausting. I want to be able to go out more often, for example. So that's an example of taking a little tiny step towards that. You know, I want to be free of this, to I can just maybe perhaps walk around the block or make it a point of going down into the living room at the group home and having a conversation, or calling my therapist or case manager. That kind of thing can really go a long way. And I also want to add here that while we talk about these things in ECHO, it sounds like I could go into a counseling session with somebody experiencing psychosis, use these methods, and it should work. And it should work within a certain amount of time. And I want to reinforce that that doesn't normally happen. For clients that I've worked with, it takes a very long time, and doing interventions over and over again without judgment, without irritation or frustration, until it really begins to sink in and become part of their internal experience. There are direct methods to work with a fixed, rigid delusion. I will say that it's hard to do, and having some experience and mentorship is really important for this. If you recall, in some of the trainings that we've given, we have actually taken somebody from the audience and said, where do you live? They give us, where do you live? And we say, well, that's not true. You know it's not true. And go through that whole process. You know, the truth is that you've been stalking somebody, and you have a restriction from going to their home. You know, somebody were saying that to me, and I wouldn't have expected it. I'd say you're crazy, and I'd probably end up in a hospital. There's a really lovely YouTube video of Xavier Amador, who does this exercise. So if you look up Xavier Amador, go to one of his YouTube lectures, and you can find that. And he does it really, really beautifully. Empathy is really important. We have to have empathy for what that person is experiencing, whether what they're experiencing is factual or not, because to them it is, in fact, factual. They are hearing the voices. They are experiencing the thought insertion, or the, what I mean is invasion of intrusive thinking. If I were thinking I might get crucified, I'd be freaked. So we want to see it from their point of view. Yeah, that would be terrifying. Let's figure out how we can respond to this so that your terror isn't up at 100. Maybe we can get it to 80 or 70. That would be a significant drop, at least to start with. And that may take some time. And truthfully, how would I like somebody to respond to me if I spouted out a belief that's not consensus reality or not in keeping with Western culture? You know, I would have people look at me strangely, and in fact, that's actually happened to me. So it's really a shaming experience to have somebody say, you know, that's not true. What you're experiencing is not there. Is a very humiliating and shaming experience. So to say that, you know, is just not helpful. There are some lovely articles on using guided imagery for reduction of delusions, even for patients who have a 100% belief in those delusions. And I think that our references for that are on the next slide. Guided imagery for reduction of delusions is a very powerful intervention. So the biggest part of that is that it leads to imaginal exposure, and we know that exposure leads to desensitization, which leads to a decrease in stress. And so what we would do would be to do an imagery exposure and then do some re-scripting with that with a client's help. Having humor in that is very helpful so that they can have an experience of laughing and doing something different with the image that they have. So in one of the articles, the client described having an issue with the devil, and his image when it was re-scripted was, I see a dolphin slapping the devil with a flipper on a YouTube scene, and he started to laugh. And that lowered the distress immediately, and suddenly he's connecting the funnier YouTube vision with this thought about the devil, and it didn't hold quite as much weight. Imagery re-scripting flash forward. Where would you like to go? Even if this delusion or this belief system is part of your life, what would you like to be doing anyway? And what would that look like? So adding that into the script is very powerful. For those of you who know EMDR, it's almost like doing EMDR without the tapping or without the light bar. It's just the protocol without that. In CBT, it's common to do imagery re-scripting with nightmares. So to have the person share the nightmare, but in the middle of the nightmare, decide that it's going to end differently and write out what that script would be. Read that script before they go to bed several times during the day, and just to see what happens. Oftentimes the nightmares begin to diminish. So those are two very powerful ways to deal with that directly. I believe that we all have some delusionary thinking, even if we're just misinterpreting what somebody else says. And we all make cognitive errors. So we can all do some education about our cognitive errors. Clients seem to really feel better when I'm able to say, you know, I do that too, or I have to work on that, or my husband caught me saying I'm sorry all the time, and that I really needed to stop that. Those little tiny disclosures go a long way in building trust and for normalizing as well. So very gentle education is important. With clients that I have with fixed delusions, we will address it and it will get as far as we can, and then when there's no movement,
I generally drop it and go on with a different issue, and at some point in time, go back in and just test that to see where it is, dropping little seeds along the way about, gee, I wonder about this, or I wonder about that, and then truly not going any further with that, but going on to a different issue. You'll find that in 6 weeks or 2 or 3 months, they may come back with that same intervention that you dropped a seed for, and they've made some sense and meaning out of it for themselves. I think that's also very powerful because it comes from them. But the seed dropping is really important. We want to reduce the impact. Even if the delusions stay on as severe as they always have been, it's important to reduce the impact if we can. So I have a client, and I said to him, he said, people will not accept me if I have this belief. And I looked at him and said, boy, you know, there's a lot of people in the United States that have a lot of really odd beliefs, and they get married and have kids and own a home and go to work. And that's fine. You know, there's nothing wrong with you having a belief that's different from mainstream. But the deal is that you also want some other things in your life. So given that you have this belief, how can we reach other goals that you have, like living independently, having a job? And so here we have now a client who is in fact living independently, does have a job, is working on getting driving again, and still holds that severe delusion, but is negotiating it just a little bit better, using some relaxation and calming strategies when he feels that coming on, and let them know how important it was for them to share that, really recognize the courage that it took to share that, given that most of the time people will look at them, if they had shared that, with a cocked eye. So here is, this is not really delusionary as much as it is hallucinatory, but I could develop a delusion on this. So if you see this picture and you look at it directly, you'll see that there's dots kind of moving around in the intersection of those white lines. And I cannot not see them. Every time I look at it, I cannot not see the dots. Do you see the dots?
I do see the dots.
Now, if you look at this image from a very severe angle, the dots go away, but head on, they look like that. So this is an experience where delusions might be born. And just to keep in mind that we all can misinterpret things, and we all can develop a belief that is out of mainstream. It's important to keep them safe, to reduce the impact and harm, and also work with them to reach their life goals, no matter what their belief may be, given that they're safe and they can manage their life more and more each time. Again, it takes quite a while to work with somebody with a fixed delusion. So don't expect to be able to go in and do several interventions and have it work. It won't immediately. It will take time. So with that, questions, and there I have a hand with the light bulb answers, and I don't believe it's that easy.